Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, as the case may be. I'm Sanford Ungar, known by most as Sandy, and it's my pleasure to moderate the first session of the virtual 55th reunion of the Harvard-Radcliffe classes of 1966. Welcome, everybody. Just a couple words of introduction. After careers in journalism and higher education, I'm now teaching undergraduates at Georgetown University and running a free speech project there. Having stepped down as president of Goucher College in Baltimore after 13 years, I'm back living full-time in Washington, D.C. and nearby rural Pennsylvania. I also, relevant here today especially, is that for 6 fall semesters, I taught a freshman seminar at Harvard after leaving Goucher. And you'll hear from some of my star students in the course of this program. I've long been fascinated by the contrasting nature of identical blocks of time. And the reunion committee has given me the opportunity to explore that issue today by looking at the class that graduated 55 years before us and the one that graduated last week, 55 years after us. Are we at the statistical midpoint in every way and only that? Or are we more like one or the other? And what are the implications? So we will proceed today by having a hearing about the class of 1911, which was celebrating its 55th reunion at the time of our commencement in 1966, and then hearing about Harvard undergraduates generally today with a bit of a focus on the class of 2021. And then the discussion of our class will be led off by 2 other members of it. So I'll introduce people in turn. Richard Rabinowitz, whom I met when I stumbled through the fire door into his adjoining room in Wigglesworth Hall during the fall of our freshman year in September 1962, has spent his career creating history museums and exhibitions in every corner of the United States. He's also published several books on history and museum work, including Objects of Love and Regret, Family History, which is forthcoming from the Harvard University Press in 2022. I asked Rich to delve as deeply as he could into the class of 1911 and tell us about it. Rich, take it away.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to see many of you, old faces, old friends. Ever since our own commencement week in Cambridge, I've wondered whether we would look as weird to succeeding classes as our predecessors did to us. I remember meeting these 2 fellows from the class of 1916, veterans of the American Expeditionary Force that fought in France during World War I, during that commencement week. It felt to me as though I'd met people who were on the Crusades in the Middle Ages, with Napoleon in Russia. They seemed very ancient. So I really loved Sandy's inquiry about being able to do this. So I began to do a little bit of noodling around. It's a little difficult to do it during the pandemic. The university to which the class of 1911 was admitted was still concentrated on Harvard College, an all-male undergraduate institution. The medical and law schools were well established. They had national reputations. And the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences were turning out a few PhDs, but there wasn't a business school until the following year, and there were no graduate schools yet in design or education or public health or engineering. The college, to my a little bit of surprise, was a much more local, even parochial institution. And the most obvious evidence of that is the second-class status of Radcliffe women in the educational milieu of Cambridge, living apart in the Radcliffe Quad, consigned to courses in the Radcliffe Yard, taught separately by Harvard professors. I hope that some of you got to listen and watch the session last Friday about the Radcliffe Alumni Oral History Project that the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco was putting together, a really wonderful and very important project. A sign of the high self-regard with which Harvard treated its young men, but not its young women until 1973, is the quinquennial class report. the Red Book, which goes back all the way to the era of the American Civil War. There's an amazing amount of really rich material in these books, historical material. But during the pandemic, I couldn't get up to Widener or Houghton from New York, where I live, or wherever the books are in Cambridge. But the Harvard Club of New York has an excellent set, and the club welcomed me to its beautiful, and I have to say, almost deserted library during April and May. And so I got a chance to look at the books for the class of 1911. Of course, as we all know, we've been knowing this for at least 50 years, the class reports are very imperfect historical sources. They're far from objective studies or observations of the evolution of a class. Sometimes each of us has contributed more or less at length and so on. They're not really what a historian can rely upon or a social scientist do any study. And I haven't had a chance, so this is only an impressionistic glance. I didn't look at the Crimson for these years. Crimson was founded in 1873, so I couldn't get a deeper dive into this material. So I'm going to share my screen and okay, is that working?
Nope, not yet.
Not yet. How about this?
There it
Now we
goes.
see it.
Okay. So from the yearbook that was issued at commencement in 1911, I learned that there were about 700 students in the class, almost 500 of whom received AB or SB degrees that June. Of the 548 in total who responded to inquiries, almost half came from Massachusetts, which is surprising. Another 56 took the New Haven Railroad or father's chauffeured limousine from New York. Just 9 arrived from California. 8 had been born in Russia. They were probably immigrants. Only 1, astonishingly, was from the state of Connecticut. Obviously, eligible men, young men in the Nutmeg State, customarily went to that other college. 65 men were the sons of Harvard graduates, far more than any other college. It's only 1 son of Eli gave up the blue for crimson. The class of 11 drew 17 students from Exeter and 9 from Andover, but many more from local public schools, 27 from Boston Latin, 8 from Boston English, 14 from Cambridge Latin. But you have to consider that in 1907, only 9% of 18-year-olds in the United States graduated from high school. So it was still a high school diploma was a very significant credential. 118 of the respondents were Episcopalian, 19 Unitarian, 18 Roman Catholic, and 30 were Jewish. Though Republicans outnumbered Democrats 5-1, there were also 7 professed socialists in the class of 1911. The next year, of course, was in the election of 1912, Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, got 6% of the vote, almost 1 million votes. So getting 2% of the Harvard electorate was not exactly such a surprise. About 40% had already traveled abroad, they said, by the time they graduated. 3/4 of them smoked and drank alcohol regularly. About 1/3 had done philanthropic work while in college. Well over half claimed to have worked during the summer to help pay for their college, which is about $200 a year. So far as I can see, the class was entirely composed of white men, or maybe nearly so. The 50th report for that class, 1961, noted that a classmate from Thailand, had, quote, never been heard of since leaving college. Those who knew him well remember that most cheerful and human Oriental. So, what about their education? Let me move. This is a view of what the class yearbook looked like. You'll notice if you look really class that there's a lot of emphasis upon the clubs that people belong to in here. I'll get more to that. Seaver Hall was an important part of their education. 80 reported that their favorite coursework was in economics, 51 in English, and 35 in history. The domination of the classics was long gone, as well as the moral philosophy courses that dominated the pre-Civil War Harvard. It was still possible to get through 4 years of Harvard by taking all introductory courses, Ec 1, Philosophy 1, and so on. It doesn't seem to have been a particularly rigorous school. There were relatively few scientists or engineers in the class. A tenth, as I said, received a Bachelor of Science degree. In our day, I recall that there were lecture courses and seminars and individual tutorial and directed reading courses. These words do not appear in accounts of the class of 1911. Instead, they were expected to attend recitations, mandatory, but reputedly very easy to cut. This tells me that a Harvard education was still largely the transmission of knowledge from experienced teachers and scholars to naive students. Research techniques and projects, which was such an important part of my own Harvard experience, seem to have been absent, except perhaps for students preparing senior honors essays. The best question on the questionnaire posed to graduates was this: what advantages do you think you ought to have found at Harvard that you have failed to find? That's a nice question. 27 would have liked a closer relation between faculty and students, which I think is a perennial response. 23 thought that a new gymnasium was just the thing that a Harvard education really needed. Only one missed a more serious regard for scholarship among undergraduates. No one argued for better scientific research facilities or bemoaned the lack of a first-class research library. Widener was actually 4 years away after graduation, opened in 1915, and of course was still closed to Radcliffe for many years. Most students felt that they had not taken good advantage of the opportunities offered, which is probably a perennial complaint, except in athletics and in social, which meant club life. Okay, so here's Memorial Hall, where a lot of students then and again now had their meals. This was the Harvard Coop. This is the Lampoon in 1910. Sports was a really big deal. The yearbook detailed the outcome of every single match played by a Harvard team during all 4 years in Cambridge. So the squads were all pictured in the yearbook: the hockey team, the baseball 9. More unusual, at least for our generation, was the publication of lists of members for each of the final clubs. And there were many, many clubs, many more than I think than there were in our day or they are today. In some measure, club membership was a crucial aspect of male social life in the first half of the 20th century. And in the Red Books, there was much more attention paid to club membership among alumni than to the children or spouses of the alums. If you wanted to locate a Harvard man in Chicago or Columbus, the obvious place to look was the local Harvard Club. In general, college life seems to have been more frolicsome. Many Harvard students found their way to the old Howard and other burlesque and vaudeville houses in Boston's Scully Square, which is now buried under Government Center. Ann Corio, one of the last of the old-time strippers at the Howard, was actually elected to membership by the Harvard class of 1937. The theater burned down, incidentally, in June of '61, just before we got to town. Alexander's Ragtime Band. This is the sheet music, which is really important in these days, was Irving Berlin's first great hit, and this was the year's #1 tune. So here's what it sounded like at the time. For the class of 1911, reunions were pretty boisterous celebrations. Famously, on the occasion of the third year reunion, these fellows felt like having reunions almost every year, the class chartered a steamboat to take it to an outing at Manchester by the sea. Obviously well lubricated, the 25-year-old Harvard seized control of the vessel, broke into the box of signal bells, and created havoc in Boston Harbor by signaling other boats to turn every which way until the captain and the mate restored order aboard. The Red Book includes a picture of the celebrants in drag, obviously inebriated. Isn't that great? That was in June of 1914. 2 months later, of course, Europe was at war. Some in the class flocked to join the British and French forces, especially in the aviation squads. But less than 3 years later, when the United States had entered the war, as many as 40% of the class of 1911 joined up, which is a lot higher than our class in Vietnam. As far as I could see, there was no anti-war movement at Harvard. I couldn't find any evidence of pro-German sentiment among the class. In October 1918, the class report noted, at this time when the principles of liberty and democracy are at stake, there is no sacrifice too great to make for the sake of these ideals and in the service of our country. At least 17 members of the class died in military service, and more than a dozen more of the veterans in the immediate aftermath of the war, perhaps of injuries. But the greatest impact was to cast a kind of pall over these men. The class reports of the 1920s are anything but roaring. These alumni got down to work pretty earnestly. By 1921, the 10th report, the majority were in mercantile and finance positions. Many seem to have moved all across the country to assume leadership of mid-sized manufacturing and distributing companies in lumber, steel, produce, oil, adhesives, sole leather, storage batteries, office supplies, all manner of things. Companies which obviously we no longer produce much of this material in the United States. And these Harvard men became the leaders of these groups. Maybe they married the boss's daughter and took over operations, or maybe they brought New England-bred spouses to prominent social positions in Denver and Minneapolis, San Francisco. The doctors and the lawyers seem mostly to have stayed in Boston and New York. Surprisingly, the same number of respondents were in agriculture as in journalism or writing, 25. There were some tokens of an older class system. A man named Floyd Neal served, quote, as private secretary to Edward L. Frothingham of Boston during the latter's travels through Europe. Nice work, if you can get it. In general, from my brief perusal, I discovered very little upward social mobility in this crowd, or mobility of any sort. A Harvard degree offered entree into a good and apparently secure position in polite society, in the American elite. Careers and marriages, as well as places of residence, were pretty much set in one's 20s, and not much changed after that. Albert Brogan, for example, was a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas. He got his job and when he was about 25, and he remained there for his whole career. The idea of publish or perish or constant effort to gain promotion just didn't exist. Sometimes law firms dissolved and reformed, but pretty much people stayed in the same positions often for their entire occupational life. At commencement, these men were told by everyone to straighten up. The president, A. Lawrence Lowell, told them that a man's most important opinion concerned the rectitude of his own conduct. If college men have nothing else, they have an education, and they should have acquired the faculty for thinking clearly and deeply. But when you look through the books, they were apparently much less concerned with the state of American society. They almost never make observations in all of their red books about poverty, educational deficiencies, immigration, working conditions, or public health. I didn't find a single mention of race. A few of the men devoted themselves to pioneering careers in public service. One spent a lifetime creating international health programs for the new Rockefeller Foundation. Another worked as an economist at the US Department of Labor, a third as a chemist at the Food and Drug Administration. But these are very rare, especially compared to the number of our own classmates active in public agencies and private NGOs, in advocacy and in the arts and humanities. The Great War of 1914-18, I venture to think, chastened these men over the course of their whole lives. The 25th reunion report in the painful year of 1936 found many of them downcast by the Great Depression. By 1961, at their 50th reunion, perhaps half the class had already passed away. There was all that smoking, perhaps. For the survivors, the pleasures of retirement leisure had proliferated. Travel, horses, collecting art or rare stamps, lots of golf, sailing, gardening. No marathon runners, no triathletes, not so much philanthropy or volunteering with local organizations. They spoke little about the enthusiasms for culture of the arts, for continued study, or for engagement with the world beyond America's shores. Professional interests continue to recede, one alumnus wrote. Biography gives way to more philosophical issues. But what sort of philosophy? These men, I surmise from their reports, were seldom given to introspection or to sharing their innermost thoughts with peers. Even those in the ministry talked more about the succession of pulpits they served rather than on their encounter with ultimate issues. The artists and writers check off publications and awards, but not the questions that they're trying to address. So the class of 11, at least on these pages, seems to have indulged a lot less in self-evaluation than ours, to have been more socially stable and secure than we, and suffered far worse health outcomes than we have. They seldom thought that private life was public business. They come across to me as cold, austere men, little given to sentiment or imagination. When they wrote their 50th class reports, Dwight Eisenhower, an exact contemporary, was president of the United States. Like Ike, members of the Harvard class of 1911 had largely unquestioningly assumed the burdens of national and local leadership. Harvard seems to have taught them little about the country they led. During their lifetimes, the nation's population had nearly doubled from 92 million in 1910 to 179 million 50 years later. Much of the class of 1911's life experience had apparently made them wary of the way the United States had changed. So Harvard changed a great deal between that class and ours, mainly, I think, under the presidency of James Bryant Conant, who brought in such an emphasis on science and technology and research and on Harvard's responsibility around the world, especially during World War II. But I would surmise that Harvard 66, our class, was socially, economically, and demographically essentially an expanded and nationalized version of Harvard 11, overwhelmingly white, male, privileged, educated to the principles of Matthew Arnold, conservative in musical and artistic taste, and pretty self-satisfied. Our cohort was certainly chosen on supposedly more selective meritocratic grounds. The SAT exam was required after 1934. There was definitely an established order to Cambridge life. Of course, we may have been living at the very end of that kind of order in things. The image that sticks with me most is that of the character of Clarence Day in Life with Father. Howard Lindsay of the class of 1911 wrote the play Life with Father with Russell Crouse, and he actually performed in this role for 7 years on Broadway. It's the longest running straight play in the history of Broadway. And I remember the adaptation that ran on television on CBS in 1953, 55, and I don't know if any of you watched those as I did. In those stories of upper-class Victorian New York, the austere paterfamilias, cold and forbidding on the outside with a heart of gold, full of ferocious opinions, but clearly clueless about his own truest inclinations. That's what these Harvard men of 1907 to 11 suggest to me. They seem to be already antiques in their prime of life. Are we? So let me turn that over to our current.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. A very stark and clear portrait of the class of 1911. If you unshare your screen, there we go. So the next two speakers are, just to go back for a moment, I taught a freshman seminar in the fall semesters from 2014 through 2019. And my groups, which were generally about between 12 or 13 students each year, bonded very closely. We got to know each other quite well, but I would say the class of 2018, the next to last year that I did this, was particularly unified and a very, very interesting group of people I got to know well. So faced with this question of how do we find out about today's undergraduates, class of 2021. For practical reasons, I turned to two members of originally the class of 22, now the class of 23, because they took this year of the pandemic off. They have asked to introduce themselves rather than my telling you about them, but they are Julia Martine and Samson Mstashari, and they will take it away.
Presentation up and running.
Sure. So I think while Julia shares her screen and gets the PowerPoint up to you guys, there we go. I'll introduce myself real quickly. Great to meet you, class of 1966. My name is Samson Mstashari, and I am now in the class of 23, originally from DC. When I get back to campus in the fall, I'll be studying social studies, and I'll be living in Leverett House. When I'm not doing academics, I'm strongly involved with the Din and Tonics, that is Din with a D, a jazz a cappella group, in the International Relations Council and the Institute of Politics. So now I'll turn it over to Julia, my good friend, classmate, and of course, presentation partner.
Thanks, Samson. So wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the time. And what an honor it is to be able to get to meet and get to know, hopefully, the class of 1966. So thank you. I'm Julia. I'm originally from New York, though on campus, I call Leverett House my home. And Samson and I are a bit biased, but we do believe that Leverett House is the best. We can save the debate for the Q&A later. I study applied math with a focus in economics and computer science. And in my free time, I'm very much involved in social organizations on campus. So I'm the president of a former sorority, now called the Themis Asteri Club, as well as giving tours for the Harvard admissions office. And before I give it back to Samson, Rich, it was very helpful to get that context of what it looked like in the class of 1911, and hopefully we'll have more of an opportunity to get to know what it was like to be part of the class of 1966. And I'll tell you, for Samson and I, it's very unimaginable to think about what it must have been like to be part of the Harvard at that time, 55 years ago. As I'm sure a lot of what we'll touch on today will hopefully surprise you as well. The school has really changed in the past 55 years. I think we all know that, but there's been a real increase in diversity, within the student body, the diversity of backgrounds and perspectives within the student body in terms of the course and extracurricular offerings. And so Samson and I are just very excited to have the opportunity to give you a glimpse of what it's like to attend Harvard today. So with that, Samson, why don't we tell them a little bit more about how we met?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So as Sandy mentioned, we were part of a 13-person course on free speech, our freshman fall of 2018. One of the strict, hands down, best courses we ever taken, and I'm not just saying that because my teacher is listening to me right now. But each week, this course covered sort of a different facet of free speech, a different tough question, and we opened it up to student debate in a real sort of Socratic style. So when Sandy reached out to do this, we knew we'd love to take it on. Julia and I gossip about Harvard all the time. So what we see ourselves as doing now is doing the same thing we always do, just in front of, a few more people. But before I get into it, we'll go on a brief tangent right now about how Julia and I first met, because I think the story is both funny and sort of instructive. The week before class, Sandy sent us an email welcoming us to the class, giving us a brief homework assignment, and asking us to respond to confirm our receipt of that email. Folks, Julia and I were the only two people not to respond to that email in a timely way. And we received this email in response.
Oops, sorry.
So while Julia pulls this up, I'll just talk about it. As terrifying as this email was to receive, I am in the end very grateful for it. Why don't I feel like this will not make sense until y'all can read the email.
I'll share it, Sam. I'm getting it up. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Here we go.
Sure. So, it was terrifying to receive, but, even the most delinquent freshmen, I think, can rehabilitate themselves in the eyes of a kind professor. I think it's a testament to Sandy's generosity that he, moved past this and I think we consider ourselves quite close with him now. And, more broadly, I think tough love is very important for freshmen going into the fall. We were coming from high school, and learning how to sort of interact professionally was a great lesson. And more sort of philosophically, I think, at Harvard, there are so many experiences that you just have to grab. And you can't wait, for instance, 72 hours to get a great opportunity when it comes knocking. And I think that was a great lesson. So, just like we jumped at the opportunity to take free speech, we jumped at this own opportunity, and we're so happy to be here now.
Yeah, and I'll add to that by saying we chose to start with this anecdote because we really felt that the course itself was a microcosm of the Harvard that we experienced. It brought together, as you can see, we have this picture on the left, a bunch of different people from all over the United States and internationally, with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different perspectives. I mean, I really think it was such an amazing opportunity as a Latina from New York to be in a class with a Sikh from Mississippi, with a Persian Jew from outside of DC, and having that experience was really, really contextualized the next 4 years of our Harvard experience. Going forward, so we thought it'd be a great idea to give you a bit of a snapshot of what the makeup of the class of 2021 looks like. And so we're very lucky because the Crimson, the school's newspaper, every year sends out a survey to the incoming freshman class, and basically asks them a variety of questions, everything from, what gender are you, where are you from, to things like, have you ever cheated on an exam before, and other interesting questions like that. And so while we won't be able to get or touch on every single statistic, we thought we would highlight a couple that we thought were interesting. And of course, we can save some more for some time for the Q&A to answer some further questions. But starting out, Samson, I'm sorry, but I always knew women were smarter than men. And I think this is scientific proof that that is the case. In the class of 21, the majority of enrollees are female. In fact, that's actually the case for every single class since then. So 22, 23, and 24. I mean, we'll see what happens later, but I think it's definitely a really interesting statistic. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this is, a nice visualization of where students come from in the class of 21. You'll notice that the majority come from the Northeast, 40%. And actually, it turns out that 70% of the class of 21, so the class that just graduated on Thursday, will actually end up in the Northeast. And Samson, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Sure. So attached here are some numbers about the ethnicity and race of the student body on the left and the...
Samson, can you get a little closer to your microphone, please?
Oh, yes. Is this better?
Yes.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. On the left is data about the ethnicity and race of Harvard students, and on the right is their family income. So I think it's interesting to see sort of the changes that have been that have happened in the past 55 years, and also the changes that have perhaps not happened in the past 55 years. But while we're on the topic of ethnicity and race, I thought I'd let you in on what has really been the talk of the town at Harvard. And something that many of you may have been following along with if you read the Crimson or the Harvard Gazette. But for those of you who aren't as avid readers of the Crimson, I'll fill you in really quick on the SFFA versus Harvard court case, which has been making a lot of news lately. This is an affirmative action case in which this activist sort of, conservative group challenged Harvard's admissions policies, alleging that they discriminate against Asian applicants. And Harvard fended off this lawsuit. A Massachusetts court ruled in favor of them. The lawsuit is not necessarily over. It may get all the way up to the Supreme Court and would be a very interesting case to watch. But what I'm interested in telling you is how the student perception of this case has been and how it's been taken by the student body. Because over the course of this case, Harvard had to release some documents as to their admissions practices, which ended up being somewhat embarrassing for the admissions office in the way that they sort of reviewed Asian applicants sort of in subjective measures. With the essays, the interviews, Asian applicants were often rated as being as lacking in personality, lacking in differentiation, or sort of passion. And so the overall, this is interesting, I think. It says a lot about the student body because the overall climate of the student body is quite, progressive, overall in favor of affirmative action. And, the students that I've talked to have had a lot of praise for Harvard in defending this practice in court. And at the same time, there's criticism of certain aspects of their sort of subjective admissions policies that have, that cause a lot of controversy on campus. And so I thought this would be an interesting thing to talk about, especially because I know the 60s were their own time of sort of activism when everyone had strong political opinions. And I think the political climate of the 2020s are defined by a lot of the same energy from my personal experience.
Moving on to academics. Thanks so much, Samson, for that. So, a lot of the concentrations that were available to you all in 1966, I'm assuming have a lot of overlap with what is available to us. And I've listed them all out here. feel free in the chat to like type in your concentration. I think Samson and I are very curious to hear what people studied. But I think one point that I really want to make on this slide is that I study applied math, and so a lot of the courses I take are housed within the engineering school and department. Samson studies social studies, so a lot of what he does is very much humanities focused. That being said, we've had a lot of opportunities to really have an interdisciplinary education. And through the general education program, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, there are really some phenomenal opportunities for us to kind of go beyond applied math or social studies, engineering, and humanities, and really get a full breadth and a great depth of an education. And I thought it'd be great actually to highlight 3 courses in particular that I'm sure you probably didn't have back in the 60s, but they'll let me know if you did, and I'm curious to kind of hear more about some of your favorite classes later. To start, there's one course called The Science of Cooking, and I think it's a great example of this interdisciplinary course where it brings together chemists and biologists and chefs and bakers alike, and you study how and why food tastes the way it does, how come certain chemical processes happen when you cook certain things. And I haven't taken the course yet, though it's in my shopping cart for next year, because I'm very excited. Apparently there's a whole week on chocolate, and so that's kind of not the only reason why I'm taking the class, but I do love a good piece of chocolate, so I'm very much looking forward to that. A second class that I thought would be interesting is to talk about is one known as quilts and quilt making. So if you direct your attention to the photo in the center, this is a course that goes through the history of quilts in the United States and about their roots in other cultures. And as a capstone project, each student is required to make a quilt of their own. And so here's a student who is very proudly showing off her quilt. It looks like a video game quilt. So very interesting. And the third class I'll mention is one called Astro-Sociology. Now, Harvard has the only astro-sociology course in North America. And if you're like me and you hear the word astro-sociology and you're very confused, let me explain. I have a very close friend of mine who took it her freshman year, actually a student of Sandy's as well. And she explained it to me as the study of what would happen if aliens came down from Earth and how humans would interact with them. So I think these are, a bunch of different various examples that hopefully kind of illustrate that, like 1966, I assume, there are a lot of opportunities to get a real depth and breadth of experiences and, take courses on subject matters that you probably would never have known about or thought about when you first enter. And with that, I'll pass it on to Samson to talk about extracurriculars.
Sure. So I'll talk about extracurriculars here. And for the benefit of those who can't see the screen, this is essentially 5 different logos and photos of various fun organizations at Harvard, which we'll touch on briefly.
Samson, can you talk louder, please?
Absolutely. And please let me know if you're having trouble. Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's a little better, Samson, but generally we need louder.
Why don't I try to move closer to the microphone and speak up?
I think that'll help.
Great. Well, let me know in the chat if you're still having trouble. So we thought we'd touch on a few interesting organizations at Harvard, student organizations. The bottom 3 being just cool ones that we thought we'd mention. The Harvard College Wine Society on the left. Julia is a member of the Wine Society, and as soon as I become of age, I will definitely join. The Quidditch Club, the Spikeball clubs, these are sort of unconventional sports. But I'll turn it over to Julia to talk a little bit about a club she's very involved in, the TA, and how that relates to sort of current events on campus.
Thanks so much, Samson. This is an anecdote that I want to bring up because I hope it really resonates with the Radcliffe women that we have on the call today. So I actually, when I was looking at colleges, I crossed out every single college that had Greek life because I was like, oh, I don't want to be part of something like that. But it turns out when I got to Harvard, I found an organization called Kappa Alpha Theta, now known as the Themis Asteri Club, which is it was then an all-female group. And it was a really great organization for me because I found a family and I found really a support network of women, female trailblazers within their fields, and just a really great group of women who I could look up to. In 2018, right as I kind of entered the college, the university decided to come up with a policy in response to what they felt was, the finals clubs being too exclusive. And so they came up with a couple policies that were going to counter and hopefully kind of make it harder for these single-sex social organizations to continue to operate. And, I won't go into the details of the policies, but, what ended up happening is that while the male final clubs were able to sustain themselves because they had the funding and the alumni network of, basically hundreds of years, many years, the female clubs were very much adversely affected. And as a result, the sororities, including the one that I was a part of, and still am today, I'm currently the president, had to disaffiliate with our national chapters and had to make the tough decision of, what's going to happen next. And so the majority of these sororities ended up going co-ed. Fast forward 2 years to June 2020, there was a lawsuit that, the sororities took against Harvard. Harvard lost almost a year ago, actually, from today. And so, as kind of leadership of this female-focused organization with, a couple men in it currently, we're at a really interesting crossroads and a really interesting time in our history as we decide what our next step is. Do we continue down the route of being co-ed and continue to kind of, bring men into the group? Or do we think back to our roots and do we, really cherish the female-only aspect and kind of support network that was available to me when I first entered? And so, happy to talk more about that later as well, but I think it's just a really interesting example and, anecdote that I want to share with you, especially the women in the group. And with that, Samson, why don't you talk about your incredible Din and Tonics group?
Sure. By the way, I just connected external headphones, so I'm hoping that people can hear me better, but please let me know if there's still problems. Wonderful.
Great, Samson.
Awesome, glad to hear. So yes, I am a member of the Harvard Din and Tonics. We are a jazz a cappella group, and we are traditionally all male. The year that I joined, however, that was the first year that we co-educated. We now have 2 women in a group of 12, and we're hoping soon to achieve gender parity. But as I'll talk about, that's sort of a hard thing to do in any sort of timely way. This is, by the way, a photo of us on the top. And when we went co-ed, there were a lot of sort of knock-on effects that we had to deal with. Questions of attire, as you can see, we're all in tuxes, and the question was, what do the women in our group wear? Questions of repertoire. We currently are a tenor, baritone, bass group. For those of you musically inclined, you'll know that these are traditionally male voice parts. And the question is whether we accommodate higher voices by rearranging our music, redoing the 40 years worth of repertoire that we've built up to accommodate higher vocal ranges. And all of these discussions, there has been an intense back and forth between the 12 members of the group, both male and female, and also the Alumni Council, and everyone has their own strong thoughts. One of the guiding principles that we have has been sort of listen to the women in the group in order to be as inclusive as possible. The women in the group, however, do not always agree on every issue, on what our attire should look like, on how we should label our music. And so I think this speaks to some of the sort of ways that Harvard is still working on and grappling with difficult questions that have started ever since the integration of Radcliffe in the 70s and continue to the present day and even into the future. But ultimately, I am personally very proud of my group for what we've done in the past, and I think that this is a real opportunity to show people that jazz a cappella can be both co-ed and excellent, if I do say so myself.
If you ever have the chance when you're on campus to listen to a Din and Tonics concert, I highly recommend. Samson has a great voice and definitely enjoy every performance. Before we conclude, we would be remiss not to talk about the impact coronavirus has had on the Harvard school experience. And we, I think Samson and I have a very, very unique experience because we comprise the roughly 21% of the student Harvard, the Harvard student body that took a year or a semester off this year in an effort to ride off the pandemic and, have other educational opportunities, not in the form of, a Harvard classroom, a Harvard, Zoom classroom, because everything was online. And, I can't speak for the other 79% that were taking courses on Zoom. I can speak about, what this year has meant for both Samson and I. This year, Samson, the smart guy that he is, was doing research with a Harvard Law School professor on food law. And I was working at a boutique investment bank doing transactions in the cosmetics and fashion space. And I highlight this, and I wanted to end on this because it really was a year that we allowed students, the 21% of us that took some time off, to reflect on our Harvard experiences, to discover passions of ours that we might not have discovered otherwise. And you can see in the bottom right corner, some dishes, some food. Samson and I are becoming quite the chefs, if I must say so myself. And then one final thing is, we've been able to get closer to people that we otherwise might not have had the opportunity to. And I'm so lucky, Samson, that this year we've had the chance to get to know each other better, and hang out, with each other and our friends, because I know it's been, an experience that I'll never forget. And with that, Samson, I'll hand it back to you to conclude.
Yes, I feel exactly the same way, by the way. And, I have not taken a Harvard course for 12 months. Julia has not taken a Harvard course for 12 months. But that distance, I think, has reminded me all the more of how much Harvard means to me. Like the fact that even despite the distance from the academic side of things, despite a physical distance from campus over this COVID year, like my social relationships, the people I've met, we've gotten closer than ever. And I, by the way, think my friendship with Julia is a great example of that. And I've come to really appreciate like what Harvard was by the fact that I haven't had it this past year. And so I'm really excited to like cherish the next 2 years that I have with these people, with this institution. And as you guys look back on your 55 years out of college, I'd love to hear your takes on what Harvard was like back in the day, how it's the same, how it's different. But I know it's a really meaningful institution for all of us. That's why we're here. And so I'm really glad I could share this with you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Samson and Julia. That was great. And I appreciate your taking the time to do something entirely voluntary and a favor to the class of 66. I thought we'd start off our conversation by asking two people in our own class in 66 to offer their observations on the basis of these very quick surveys about how the class of 66 fits in. First is Evan Davis, whose father was in the Harvard class of 1938, by the way. He was the first in his family among his forebears to attend college. Not Evan, but his father. Evan is a retired litigation partner and at an international law firm, Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, has been a trustee of Columbia University, where he attended law school, led the Watergate and cover-up task force of the Nixon impeachment inquiry, has been president of the New York City Bar Association, and serves as counsel to Governor Mario Cuomo. Evan, I have known you since our freshman year together and great admirer of your public service work. I understand you're now working on reforming the Constitution of the state of New York, which I'm sure needs some help. Along with Evan, we'll ask Rosalind Williams to speak. Rosalind McFarland Williams. Her grandmother Rosalind was in the Radcliffe class of 1908, and her mother was in the Radcliffe class of 1939. So she has some experience of these earlier points on the passage of time. She is a historian of technology, spent her entire academic career at MIT, including a stint as Dean of Undergraduate Education and Student Affairs. So Rosalind and Evan, I don't know which of you would like to go first, but I'd like to hear a few of your thoughts before we open the conversation up to the entire class.
D comes before W, so Evan?
Okay, so I share Sandy's interest in blocks of time. It has occurred to me that if you assembled 10 people and magically could get people from past and present separated by 50 years, 10 people would cover 500 years. So you could go back to Plymouth Rock and hear the story of our country from the perspective of those 10 people. And if you went to 20 people, you could go back 1,000 years. If you went to 40 people, you could go back and visit the Roman Senate and hear what that was like, as you could go back 2,000 years. So blocks of time are interesting. And I think they also illustrate that you have to think of the block as being overlapping. So for example, when we arrived at Harvard College, we were the product of a society that we've been living in for the 18 years before. And that society was very, very calm and bland. No one was in the street marching for Adlai Stevenson. Dwight Eisenhower was perfectly fine to many people and very calm and peaceful. And so we lived in a world when we arrived at college that had a limited, almost non-existent amount of chaos. And I think in that way, we're similar to the class of 1911 as described by Richard, because they also seem to come from a world with limited chaos, where everybody knew where they were going and what they wanted to do. At least they thought they knew that. And then you have the surprises that come. I've always thought that it's so hard to predict 50 years into the future. I don't know if that fact agonizes the class of 21, but it agonizes me a little bit that it's really hard to see and know what the world's going to be like in 50 years, given how much it's changed. Some of the story we just heard is very positive from the point of view of change from 1911 through 2021. I would say diversity and inclusion stands out very clearly. The class of 1911 was not diverse in any respect. It was exclusive, not inclusive. It was discriminatory. It was terrible from that perspective. When we got there, while Harvard was still Harvard and Radcliffe was Radcliffe, the classes were held jointly, so that was an improvement. But in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, people of color, not very good at all. I don't know the exact statistics, but it's certainly a weak comparison to what was described for the current class. So that's been an area of progress. We've also lived through both the 50-year block from 1911 to 1966, and from 1966 to 2021, both had an incredible amount of invention and technological change. And that was, I think each period, I think it's hard to distinguish the amount of change that occurred in each of those periods. The first period, you had incredible changes in transportation, airplanes, flying around the world, going to meet people, taking vacations that were impossible before. You have the electricity, you have indoor plumbing, you have rural electrification, you have a great change in the world there. And of course, in the second 50-year period, we've got the revolution of the internet and just fantastic ability. If you ever want to look something up, you don't have to go to Widener Library anymore. You just Google it, and there you can find it. So that's a fantastic change. And it's hard to know what we're going to be in the next 50 years. I mean, people talk a lot about artificial intelligence and job shrinking. Who knows? I think it's very, very difficult to predict that will be it, and it won't be something else we can't even imagine now. Politically, I think the class of 1911 didn't have much political, they were all happy with their positions. They were apparently all Republicans. In our class, things were just beginning to heat up politically when we graduated, and then certainly became much more active after we graduated. And the poor class of 2021 lives in political chaos, starting with 2020 election, decided by the Supreme Court. Every election has been close, contested, great difference of opinions, some of them seeming totally non-factual and irrational. Very difficult environment. I don't envy this class, and I hope they can do something to straighten it out, although it's a difficult thing to fix. So those are my, Sandy said I should be spontaneous. So I tried to be spontaneous, and those are my spontaneous observations. I think this has been a useful exercise to hear from Richard and the students, and we'll see where it goes. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Roz.
Yeah, the analogy of blocks interests me a lot. So I would describe my experience as a class of 66 as being at the point where the blocks fell apart. In other words, there was a dramatic change of consciousness at the moment that I was in college. And I'm speaking now of women's consciousness specifically. You mentioned my mother and my grandmother both went to Radcliffe. They both had an excellent college education, but the assumption was that it was an education that would be expressed in community activities, in some intellectual activities, but as part of a community and a network of friendship. It would not be expressed in earning a living in a paid job, except maybe after the children had left the house and then maybe part-time. So it was not a vocational education concept at all. And so the class of 66, from a woman's point of view, is absolutely pivotal. It's not like a slow upward or downward line. It's like 5 years earlier, the concept of a woman's education is, as I described, if you were a mother and a family person, you didn't work for a living, but that education was still very important. That's the consciousness that came out of the 50s. But I've often thought if I had come to Radcliffe 5 years earlier, that would have been my mindset. If I had come 5 years later, it would have been completely changed. You know, that women are there for education, for a career, for paid work of some kind, and that is what that education is for. 5 years earlier, 5 years later, completely different mindsets. And what is so interesting about the class of 66, from a woman's point of view, we had both. It wasn't either or. It wasn't like, oh, I used to think that, now I think this. We had both in our heads and our hearts. And that led to some very interesting time periods in our life where we had this education. Speaking for myself, I didn't go on for a PhD. I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. I got married. I taught migrant workers in Florida. I taught writing. I wrote on my own. I tried different things. I had that period of looking around because I wasn't sure which model suited me. And that was a great gift, not to get on some beaten path right away, but to have that uncertainty. One of the classmates at my 25th reunion said 5 years earlier, the expectation was we would marry the doctor. And now, the expectation is we are going to be the doctor, or we have become the doctor. And that's a huge change in your life. And like I say, it was really a blessing to have the 60s happen to throw everything into question so that career decisions were part of a more general reappraisal of values. And by the way, this is not just me. I mean, I think of the famous founding mothers of NPR. They're also women of my age who the regular jobs didn't fit. So they tried something new. At MIT, the undergraduate research program was started by Margaret McVicker in a very similar spirit of things aren't fitting, let's try something new. So, I guess I would just say, I think it's important we don't think that women's education is now a solved problem. It's an obvious thing. Of course, women are going to do what men do and follow those paths. If the last year taught us anything, it's that childcare arrangements, so that you assume you're going to work and have a family at the same time, those arrangements are very rickety, very flimsy. They don't fit a lot of people. They aren't working. And I take this as a message from history to tell us, stop what we're doing. Let's think about this. Let's use this opportunity to think of some new arrangements and some new ways of looking at things, because we don't have that problem solved, and we shouldn't pretend that we do. It's better off to try to have a change for the better rather than pat ourselves on the back and say, well, women's issues, that's all yesterday, and we have the answers now. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Roz. I would welcome contributions now from anybody who's on this Zoom. Questions for the people who've already spoken or comments on what they've said, some of your own propositions. I myself have long felt that our class of 66 was sort of the last class of the 50s. And that we still, even though as Roz describes, things were changing, I think we still accepted a lot of the assumptions and the rules and wouldn't have dared to protest or make trouble, in a sense, good trouble, in the way that classes just 2 and 3 years later ended up doing. But I think that proposition still holds up, though I'm proud of what we did do when we did it. So for comments, I see David Lusk raising his hand. We'll go to you first, David. If other people want to go to the holding your hand up feature in Zoom, I think you find it in reactions. Then those people who do that will line up on my screen and be obvious. If you're not speaking to the group, please be muted. We're getting a little bit of random conversation, so we want to sort of avoid that. Let's go first to David Lusk.
Okay, thanks, Sandy, and thanks to you and your team for putting all this together. Want to congratulate and give kudos to all of the presenters. In my career with State Department, I've always been concerned about what's come before and what does that tell us about what will come afterwards. In other words, will the future reflect the past, or will the future be different from the past? To my question, for Samson and Julia specifically, I appreciate the way you've described the current ambiance of Harvard, all the courses of study and all of these things. I always wonder what it would be like to go back as a student now after a major part of one's life as in working in a career. But I wonder if the two of you, or perhaps one of you, could tell us more about maybe about yourselves and about your classmates in terms of what are the things that worry you? What are the things that you are thinking about for the future? You guys have another 50 to 70 years ahead of you now once you graduate. What do you as individuals, you as a class, hope to accomplish? In the 60s, many of us were thinking about human rights, about civil rights, about humanistic types of results and activities. Are you thinking about the same thing? When I went to Berkeley to do my doctorate in the mid-'80s, things had shifted away from the social and into the business realm. So I know these things come and go. Could you tell us what your class is worried about and what you're thinking about and how the future bodes for you from your perspective?
Absolutely. And I sort of love this question because it like puts in historical context like the fears that we have and the expectations that we have about the future, which change all the time. I think in general, people spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about the present and the near future. So I think the primary consideration for many of my classmates and even myself is, what job am I going to get after college? You know, how are my grades this semester? Like, what are my relationships with my friends like? And it is only when you take a step back, or for that matter, take a lot of time away from campus, like isolated from everyone, that you're able to think about the big existential long-term questions. And I think I've had a lot of time to do that over quarantine, and I think many of my classmates have. One thing that I've heard often is climate change as compared to COVID, right? Where COVID is a massive disruptor that changed a lot about our lives that we absolutely did not expect. Climate change is going to be way more significant than COVID, but also way more predictable. And, you know, for us who are, you know, hoping to live, you know, to see some of the like, you know, deglaciations and all these other things, like, it's scary for us as young people, I think, to think about like what the future will be like when we see sort of the exogenous shock of COVID affecting our society so much. That's the primary thought I have as to like what would be different between our like what would be sort of more of a concern for the class of 2021, 22, 23. But I think your point is very well taken, that human rights concerns, student activism, you know, the 60s were sort of famous for that time. Although I know that Sandy sort of mentioned that maybe your class was more of a 50s character than a 60s character. But I think there are a lot of similarities between the 2020s and the 1960s in the sort of student outlook on life.
Yeah, and thanks, Samson. I think I'm going to add, you know, 3 more things to that, you know, things that more thematic problems that my generation is facing that at least I know I'm thinking very deeply about. One of them is China, as Sandy knows. It's been really interesting. I studied Chinese as a language citation. And it's been interesting to see the increase in the number of students that are studying Chinese as we kind of realize the importance of China in the kind of global conversation and what that means for the United States and for our relationship with, you know, an up and coming country that's, you know, may have the power to kind of overtake us in terms of being a global power. And so I think that that's one thing that, you know, I know myself, I'm thinking a lot of about that. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of my peers as well, especially those that are studying government it's definitely on top of mind. 2 other things that I'll briefly touch on. One is privacy concerns, especially, you know, one of the 2 most popular majors at Harvard currently are economics and computer science. And so as Harvard trains the next generation of technologists, you know, it really is important to train them into thinking about what information, how do we exchange information? How do we keep people's private information secure? So that's another, you know, topic of interest. And the final thing I'll say, I don't know if this resonates, but, you know, Samson and I have definitely kind of experienced a level of cancel culture on campus of, you know, certain opinions being, you know, shut down because they don't kind of follow the common opinion. And I personally think that's a very harmful attitude, especially in an educational institution like Harvard. And so, you know, seeing how that plays out and hopefully, you know, allowing for more opportunities for people to share opinions that are not the mainstream opinion, you know, I think is important and you know, something that we will definitely focus on something we will think about as we kind of go forward.
Okay, thanks to you both. Doug, I think that's Doug Adcock, is that right? Unmute yourself, Doug.
Oh, okay, yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to mention a few things. Okay, first was during our time at Harvard, the shock of the Kennedy assassination. I think we all were part of that. Well, our freshman year, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there were quite a few, you know, shake-up things going on. But I guess my feeling is that in the 60s, although perhaps it was the late 60s, we were in grad school, that there was progress being made in civil rights, women's rights, sexual revolution, the Vietnam War, all these things were major concerns where we felt that some progress was being made. I personally was out of the country between 1970 and the year 2000. And coming back in the year 2000 to George W. Bush winning the election, as was said, by fiat of the Supreme Court, I felt like I was in a strange, different country. And now even more, it feels like there's a certain retrograde going on as far as what we thought had been accomplished in the 60s, and that the current generation is still fighting matters of racial equality and women's rights. Although there is no Vietnam War, what let me see, Julia? Yes, just said is, again, a concern about the US's role in the world. It seems like a lot of the things that were concerning us 50 years later, the progress we thought had been made perhaps hasn't been made. I don't know if the current, if Samson and Julia want to comment on that or not.
If they do, it would be very quick.
Okay. Sure. Well, one thing that strikes me very briefly is that there are two concerns people might have. The first is the concern that the US should not have a large role in the world. And the second is the concern that the US should have a large role in the world, but that role is steadily declining. I think that there is a lot of distrust in general institutions among young people today due to missteps all the way from Vietnam to Iraq and forward. So I think that the public opinion on campus is really divided as to like what the US role in the world should be, and then evaluating sort of what it actually is. I know Julia spent a lot of time in China and can maybe talk more about the direct sort of geopolitics of all of it.
Doug, I'm happy to actually, I know Sandy wants to keep this moving, but I'm happy to reach out to you and we can keep the conversation offline.
Thanks, Doug. John Caston appears next on my screen.
Thank you, Sandy. I enjoyed all this session. Just a few things. My grandfather was class of 1906 at Harvard, and I was aware he served in the Great War, and he came back, and his family also, the woman who became my mother and her family in Indiana, all caught the great flu, the great influenza of that period. And I'm struck how when Rich talked about the class of 1911, he didn't mention the great influenza, which they all endured. And of course, during the war, killed probably as many people, US soldiers, as the battles. And of course, great many civilians, and indeed may have begun in the United States. So I'm struck with that, of course, as 100 years later, here we are. And then reflecting, we all have different experiences. I would be more with Doug, I think, than with Evan in thinking about our class. I think there's a certain myth of the silent generation of the 1950s. First of all, there's a lot of recent scholarship, including Louis Menand's new book, is undermining about the so-called silent 50s. It was much more creative and filled with ferment, political, social, artistic, than it's often cracked up to be. And I think our experience at Harvard and Radcliffe was perhaps not as filled with eruptions as the late 60s. Certainly it wasn't. But our freshman year when we arrived, it was the senatorial race between George Cabot Lodge, Edward Kennedy, and H. Stuart Hughes, who was on the Harvard faculty, all representing, think of all who their grandfathers were: Charles Evans Hughes, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Joseph Kennedy. These three great Massachusetts families with very different perspectives, including Hughes running already on the anti-nuclear issues of that time, and as a democratic socialist. So, and then Madam New spoke, and there were demonstrations against her, I think during our freshman year, maybe sophomore, and there were a lot of things going on then. But one thing I'd say about our class graduating, perhaps mistakenly, is we all believed in a future in which we thought we would play significant roles one way or another. And we felt, first of all, there were jobs waiting for us, important careers waiting for us, of course, a draft waiting for us as well, and a horrible war waiting for us. So it wasn't all rosy, but I think we believed in a future that would be progressive and creative. And I'm not sure people now believe in that. Indeed, the very term "in the future" rarely appears now. People say moving forward, as if it's incremental, as if they can't imagine a long future. So moving forward, that tentative moving, has replaced the very phrase "in the future."
Thanks, John. I'm going to try to fit in at least 3 more people whose hands I've seen. David Nexon first, Alice Barbanel, and Charles True. David?
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to all the panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion. I had a sort of quick question. I think our class was very interested in public service. I think, and one major factor, of course, was this example of the glamorous, exciting Harvard man in the White House. I thought it was striking that Rich pointed out that that wasn't the case for the class of 1911, although they also had a similarly exciting Harvard man, you know, and Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. And my question really is for the current students as to what is the interest in public service amongst the current class? Is that a major career goal for many of your fellows, or are people kind of turned off politics and looking for other modes of expression?
Julia?
Take this, yeah. It's funny that you say that, dude. Actually, you know, that's something that we had not, you know, philanthropy is not, or public service is not something that the university really, you know, kind of forces students to do. I think it's really much more student organized these days. So there's really no public service requirement for graduation. And actually many, I would say the majority of students will graduate their 4 years of Harvard, not really having done much in that space. That being said, you know, there are a lot of organizations like the PBHA, the Phillips, Samson, correct me if I'm saying this right.
It's Brooks House.
Phillips Brooks House Association. I don't know if that's the right A.
Right.
But there are a bunch of student-led public service organizations that many students are very much involved with. And usually those students tend to end up in careers in law, in government, other such careers as you mentioned, David. But I hope that's helpful in terms of kind of giving a sense.
I was really asking about career aspirations as to what you think a major thrust for many of your classmates is politics and public service.
It usually is, yeah, I would say, at least from my perspective, it usually is those who study government, who kind of ultimately want to go into law, will tend to be more active in the public service spaces.
Samson, I don't see on my screen right now, but do you want to add very briefly to that? Do you think a lot of people aspire to work in government and public service in your generation? Samson may be offline.
He just
Okay.
mentioned he has Wi-Fi issues. He'll be back.
Okay, Alice Barbanel.
Thank you all. What a wonderful presentation. And I wanted to ask, especially Julia, about more of your thoughts about this having a separate sorority. But let me just say 2 things in response. One, to Rosalind, thank you for those insights. What I happened to take a year off, so I feel like I had 2 Radcliffes between 62 and 64, and I came back and there were, you know, oh my God, SDS, the Vietnam War, marijuana, sex, you know, there was it was like a different school. And one of, I don't know if Julie Cheever's still on here, but she's part of the Radcliffe College Alumni Oral History Project. She and I have made a theory called Every Year in the 60s Was Different, in terms of that dilemma of what you do when you grow up, you know, are you going to be what you use your education for? And that's one of the things we're really looking forward to finding out. But one of the themes, and then I'm hoping Julia can speak, Julia can speak, which is one of the big themes that we found from the women in the 40s and the 50s is there was something very important about having a separate Radcliffe space. A place, you know, matter all the rest of how, you know, the minority status of women, et cetera, at Harvard, but Radcliffe provided for many women lifelong friendships, places of support, you know, and you know, and to this day, women that are 95 have lifelong friendships from their earliest time. And there's something about it being a separate place that was, vital. Anyway, I'm interested, Julia, in what your situation.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, thank you for sharing that, Alice. I think that that's something that definitely resonates with me. I think, coming into Harvard, I went to a co-ed school for K through 12. And so I never really felt the need to have, my own female space, as I'd kind of just grown up being educated with men and, being treated as an equal. But when I got to Harvard, I think I really did realize, the need and the desire to have a space where I would have just kind of my own female support network. And I think it's been difficult with the Harvard policy that's kind of caused, us to become co-ed and many of the really female-focused organizations to become co-ed, to maintain that atmosphere that I'm sure you and your peers at Radcliffe really had the great opportunity to have. That being said, though, there are other organizations on campus like Women in Business, Women in Computer Science, Women in, fill in the blank, that allow to have those communities that are more pre-professional, where you'll have kind of senior women in industry who might be alumni, or, just even upperclassmen mentor you in a very pre-professional setting. But there is something to be said about having an organization that is, not pre-professional and very much more personal and more social. And I hope I'll keep in touch, but I hope that.
Yeah, I'd really like to know, we don't have time now, I know, but I'm really interested in what was it for you that made you, once you got there, to want that. And I'm told, the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco does, I think, do some sponsoring of a women's center. I don't know much about it, and that isn't pre-professional, but it's very interesting to me that that's a draw for you.
Yeah, I'll answer that briefly, and we can now, we can take this offline. I got my email.
Yeah, okay.
But I'll say, I think Harvard, coming in from a school of 120 kids, a high school of 120 kids, to a school of thousands, it's a very scary place. And being able to enter an organization where you have this sense of belonging, where you have a big, someone who's a year older than you, and eventually you'll have littles, people who are a year younger than you.
Right.
There's just something really special about that. It makes you feel tied to something in a way that no other pre-professional organization on this campus has made me feel.
Yeah. We had a Big Sisters, when we came. I'm still friends with her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask Kim, do we have a hard stop at 2:00, Kim?
We can take one last question.
Oh, I know we'll do at least one more question, but do we have time beyond 2:00? Or let's go to Charlie Trube and then we'll see. Charlie? Unmute yourself, Charlie.
Sure.
You're okay now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Get close to the microphone.
I will. Hi, everybody. Sandy, I want to agree with you that we were the last class of the 50s, although the question of how conservative the 50s really were is up for discussion. I was out of the country for 1 year after graduating in '66, and I came back to visit Harvard in the fall of '67, and it was as though the whole world had changed. And that it was the difference in tone was just astonishing. And then our 5th year book came around, and it was filled with, I went to law school, I married Susie, Wellesley 67, and it was though our class just hadn't even noticed. And I came to the 5th reunion, and there was a presentation about Harvard in 1971, and there was no discussion of the fact that the campus had blown up in the 60s. And I ended up walking away from the reunion after an hour or two. It was like, who are these people? And I was very pleasantly surprised when I came to the 25th reunion and discovered that, in fact, our class had caught up with history, that we in some ways had a delayed reaction to the event of the 60s, and that Harvard had prepared us, but we were really not part. I mean, obviously there was toxin, and there were teach-ins against the war, and I even did a few of those things. But the campus was very conservative, and it just had elements of progressivism when we were undergraduates, and that's where we came from. And I think it speaks a lot for the class of '66 that it somehow managed to transcend that. And if you then read the later class books, people turned into pretty good people. But in 1971, I wouldn't have said that about my class.
Charlie, that was a very, very astute observation, I think. I would just add that I left the country for 3 years after graduating. And when I came back in the late summer of '69, I really was disoriented.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I had been in some places where pretty exciting things were happening, but I think your observation is right on. Kim, I'm just going to ask, one other person has had his hand up. I want to make it very quick. Rod Hatter, go ahead.
I will make it very quick. I was one of the diversity students in the class of '66, coming from rural Kansas. That's quite a diverse situation at the time. I just wanted to mention to Julia and everybody else who might share this, I have said consistently since 1966 that I learned more from my fellow students than I did from Harvard while I was there. And I still believe that many years later. Thank you.
Okay, well, I get that too. Thanks very much, Rod. Thanks to everybody, Rich, Julia and Samson for your presentations, Evan and Roz for your starting off the comments, and thanks to everybody who attended. This was a little bit of an experiment, and I'm pleased by how it went, and thank you all for joining.